Hi folks, Steve here. In today's video we're going to have a look at two simple yet effective ways to paint faces with a kind of Grimdark style to them. So let's crack on. Okay, so two ways of painting faces. First one slightly longer than the other. We'll go through them both. I'm going to use exactly the same paints pretty much for both of them. It's just two ways of getting to a pretty similar result. And so I'm starting off there with a kind of mid-flesh tone and putting a little bit of brown in to bring it down. The paints I have out on the palette there, on the very top left, that's not actually a paint, even though it looks like it's got a skin tone. That's because I dipped my brush into it. That's just Floor Improver and water. Next to that there's a bone that looks almost like white. The lighter skin tone is Vallejo dark flesh, and just below that the darker skin tone is tanned flesh. And then I have a bit of dark brown as well. So I've mixed this basic colour that's going to be the darkest colour for the skin, and this is still really quite a thin colour, it's almost a glaze, and I'm just going to go over the entirety of the face with that. It's already got the zenithal prime. You can see I've got some colours on there anyway. I've already started painting these minis, but there's white on there picking out the highlights, and the shadows are quite dark anyway, so I'm just going to let this basic tone just go all over, and it'll be really transparent. So where it's already dark, it's going to dry darker, and where it's light, it'll dry lighter. So I'm not going to lose that sort of map of the values that we've already put on there. And so you can see I'm just going around just carefully. It's just painting by numbers really, just filling in the face entirely. At this point it doesn't really matter if you go over the eyes, the teeth, things like that, because we're going to go back in at the end and paint them. So at the moment all that matters is just getting a relatively smooth coat of the base tone over there. So you can see I'm going in with the lighter colour now, so I'm just lifting it up a little bit, the skin tone that I'm using, putting a bit of Floor Improver in as well, keeping it nice and thin. Testing it there on my thumb, and also making sure that my point's nice and sharp as well, which is always a good thing to do. Now what I'm going to do is go in and start picking out the areas where I'm going to focus for highlights. So this is going to be the brow, the nose, those really sharp cheeks that he's got, the upper lip, bits of the chin, side of the jaw, anywhere that we think is going to catch light. Not aiming for something that's super realistic and super accurate, just something that looks okay, that's going to stand out. So really just, like I said, picking out those edges and points where light's going to catch. Because of the slight angle of the face and the way the helmet is, it would probably naturally get a bit more light on his right hand side, which would be our left if we're looking at it. So I'll probably focus a little bit more on the left side of the face as we're looking at it, but it doesn't really make much difference at the end of the day, because I'm not going for a really high sort of display standard with this. This is just kind of a basic way of doing a face and getting something that looks pretty good pretty quick. So yeah, just see that I'm going back and forth. Can't quite see my palette, but I'm just going to the lighter colour, and if I feel it needs to be lightened up a little bit more, then I'll go for a bit more of the lighter tone at this point. Just making sure that my brush isn't overloaded, because I'm just focusing. You can see I'm really just using the very tip of my brush. Not always even doing full brush strokes. Sometimes it's brush strokes, little lines. Other times it's more of just almost just little touches of the brush, just to try and put little spots of the paint on, little deposits. The whole technique here that we're using is really about letting the transparency of the paint do a lot of work for you. So the colours that we've got underneath then going to show through to an extent, and so we're just adding little bits of texture to represent where the light's falling. The little bits of irregularities or imperfections that you get in skin, you can create quite easily just with these little dotting and dabbing kind of technique. I think painting faces or painting skin in general it can be very relaxing, but it can also be a really good way of improving your painting in general, because there's a lot of interpretation that you can do. You can use almost any colours you want when you're painting skin. When it comes to like your shadows and highlights and things like that, because skin comes in all kinds of varieties, and especially if we're doing fantasy painting or sci-fi as well, then there's really no limits to the kind of colours that you can use. There's no wrong colour, so you can really go to town and experiment and get different effects and different results. So what I'm doing at this point now we've got that initial sort of highlight stage on there, I'm getting a couple of washes. These are Army Painter washes, as you can see, but you can use whatever you've got. If you've got Games Workshop ones or Vallejo ones or Army Painter like mine, just use what you have. And the ones that I've got there that I put down is a green and purple, and I'm mixing them together and putting a little bit of flow improver in. I'm not worried about whether my brush still has a bit of that skin, the colour, the glaze on it either, because that's just going to help make it a little bit more murky. And then what I'm going to do with this, first thing to do is we're basically going to line the face by getting it around the edges of the helmet, under the jaw, things like that. And then I'm also going to start working this colour into really where my shadow is going to be. So cheeks underneath the cheekbones at the side of the face, around the eyes, maybe a little bit under the nose, things like that, just to build it in. And again, this is because it's a couple of washes mixed together with a bit of flow improver, so it's really transparent. So I'm going to go in, do it a couple of times until I'm happy with it. When it dries, it's going to it's going to be a layer on top. It's going to provide that shadow. It's going to darken things a bit, but you've still got that skin colour that we've put in underneath as well. So again, we're relying on transparency. So you're always going to be able to see the layers that are underneath, and it's just going to create that bit of an effect that we're looking for. You're just going to see when you look at the face, there's going to be different tones, different shades here and there, like you would see in a regular face. Like I said, we're not going for some masterwork. This is just a nice little quick way of doing things, but it's fun and it generates some different tones and things in it. So it's not just boring, paint it one colour, give it a wash, give it a highlight. You've got just a little bit more interest in there, which is something that I enjoy doing on faces, even when it's just a little, like a rank and file guy like this, as opposed to some big character model. Yeah, so you can just see I'm just putting in some little bits around the face there, and it does help with you twisting and tilting the model at different angles, so you can get into these little nooks and crannies where you want to put it. And I'm doing it really gently as well, so I'm not hitting the face like I would if I was applying an all over wash. I'm just putting it in a little bit at a time. There's very little on my brush most of the time. It's just a case of going in, wiping a bit of it on, and then going back and reloading my brush. And one of the most important things when you're painting like this is to really just have a little bit of patience as you do it. So we're working with paints and washes that are so thin that they will dry really quickly, but you do have to make sure that you wait until they have dried, because if you've got a layer on there and it's still, if it's not 100% dry and you go back in with a damp brush, then chances are you could just pull that layer off, and then you're just spoiling all the hard work that you've done. So just giving it a few extra seconds just to blow on it or get a hairdryer on it, something like that. Just make sure that everything's fully dry before you go back in again. And so now I'm just going to switch back over to the skin tone again. Start working on those highlights again. Now we've put a bit more shadow in. We've created a bit more depth with the wash. So going on to the lighter skin tone. So this one, I think I mentioned at the start, so this really quite light one I'm using at the moment is actually called Vallejo Dark Flesh. So the name doesn't really imply the colour of it, but it's one of my favourite flesh tones actually. It's just really good, really useful for all sorts of things. And so just testing it out on my thumb again, make sure I'm happy with it, and you can see here, we're just running it on there. You can see how a glaze works really. So where my brush is lifting up off the page, where the last bit that it touches is where the highest amount of colour is deposited, and that's how it works on your model. So when you're doing a glaze, wherever you start, should be the place where you want the least colour to be, and then you're going to draw your brush to the point where you want the colour to be at its most intense, because wherever you take your brush off, like on the paper there, is where you're going to get the highest deposit of paint. So in this instance, again, I'm going back to my technique of doing some tiny little lines, little dots, things like that, and that's how you sort of build up that very subtle amount of texture. And each time I'm going on with one of these layers of highlights, I'm trying to concentrate a little more where it's possible, just refine the area, make it a little bit smaller, the area I'm working in, so I'm not erasing all the previous highlights I've put in, but gradually you should be concentrating the brighter highlights into a smaller and smaller place, as small as you can manage, as small as your eyesight and the point of your paintbrush will allow, really. Now I'm just going to create another, basically a sort of a wash or a glaze again. So for this I'm using just a little bit of black, and I've also incorporated a bit of the flesh tone as well, so it's almost a grey, just a little bit, just to turn that colour, and it's really thinned down. And what I'm doing now, a bit like what we did with the original wash, going in with it very light, very gentle. But what we're doing now is we're concentrating on the area where facial hair would be. So this is where where a man would have stubble, and the idea is we're going to get just a little bit of a darker coloration around his jaw, his chin, just underneath where the cheekbones are, just to give that slightly unshaven look, which I think is quite a nice touch on these kind of models sometimes. And at this point I also grab a bit of that bone that's been sat there doing very little on my palette, and I'm just going to go in and catch the teeth in his mouth, just to get that out of the way. Now we've done the wash around his sort of beard or stubble area. And we'll get the eyes done as well now. And for this I'm just going to use a mix of white and the bone colour, because I don't want it too bright, so I'll tone it down a little bit with the bone. And I'm not going for super massive detail on the eyes here. All I really want to do is be able to catch the eyeball with some of this colour, just to build it up a bit. And so I'm just going to position the model so it's nice and easy for me to get to it, and I'm using the very tip, and you can see what I'm doing there. So I'm not trying to go in and paint the whole eyeball in one. I'm touching it a few times, lots of little touches, until it builds up to the point where I'm happy with it, and then switch around and do the other side. And it's a nice and easy, relaxed way of doing it, because you're not trying to do it perfect in one go, in one pass, and you can go back between the two as well if you need to balance it out, if one looks a little bit brighter than the other, or if one looks a little bit offset. Just take your time using that tip very carefully, just touch it until the point where you think, right, okay, I'm happy with that one, then go to the next one and go back if you need to, like I'm doing there. And we're not quite done on the eyes yet, because they can look a little bit boring on their own like that, so what I like to do is come in with a little bit of red wash. Again, this is an army painted red wash, but you can use whatever you've got, like Carroburg Crimson or something like that. And I'm just going to very carefully and very gently go around the eyeballs in the socket of the eyes, basically. You can do this a couple of times as well to build it up if you want. You don't have to get it absolutely perfect first time, just work it in there and repeat it until you're happy, really. I do really quite enjoy that kind of wide-eyed white eyes with the sort of the bloodshot or the red rings around it, so looks like he's definitely seen some things. He's seen some things, man. And that's basically all the steps for this first way that I'm showing you. you can go back and you can do those steps again, you can refine them, you can pop extra highlights in, you can do some more points on the eyes, whatever you want to, or just leave it like that, whatever makes you happy. So let's move on to the second way of doing these faces now. I'll get myself a new model, and you can see I've got the same palette as I had before. The difference at the moment is I'm going to start off by doing a quick wash with two of the washes that I'm mixing together at the moment, which is a red and green tone, again from Army Painter, and I'm just going to get these all over the face at the moment. I'm not going to do it too heavy. I'm still, although I want it to cover everything, I don't want it to be too strong and overbearing. I don't want to get things like coffee staining and stuff like that, so I am being careful about directing it where I want it to go, because I really want to focus on the areas that are going to be naturally darker, so the creases and crevices of the face, the back, the lower parts of the neck, under the jaw, things like that. Just get a nice coat on there, and we'll just let that dry before we move on, and that's just going to help bring out a little bit of variation in tone, a little bit of visual interest as we put the skin colours onto it. Now that's dried, so we can start adding the skin tones on. So just mixing a little bit of a base tone that I'm happy with, not too dark, not too light, and then I'm going to swap out to a different brush. So I don't want one that's got as fine a point on as the one I was using for glazing, because for this face we're going to use more of a kind of an overbrush mixed with a dry brush, so qualities of both. You can see there as I put it down on the paper, we're getting it's much more stronger than the glaze where it goes on like that. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to use the brush to gently start to work over the areas that are raised and exposed to more light, and where I want the skin tone to take. So you can see the brush I'm using there, it's actually shorter and quite a bit thicker. It's still a small brush, but there's a different body to it than the brush I was using for glazing, and it doesn't have that fine point because we don't need it for what we're doing here at the moment. Just allowing the paint to naturally catch these raised areas, so the forehead and the brow, the cheekbones, the ears, things like that. I'm doing it very softly, so it's not like a heavy dry brush where I'm trying to deposit lots of paint on all these raised areas. It's just careful and gently just adding it bit by bit, just to make sure that we don't wash out any of the colour from the wash that's underneath it. We want to continue to keep it building in nice little translucent layers, same as what we were doing in the previous version, just we're not glazing, we're essentially overbrushing, I suppose you could call it. So yeah, I'm just going to move around to make sure I've got some skin tone on pretty much every area of the model that I do want to have that tone on the face, and I'll gradually build up the colours then. Pretty much the same as before, the way we were doing the glazing. We're going to want to apply the paint in smaller and smaller areas, reducing that surface area that we're applying the colour to as we get higher and higher in value. So the brightest of light, or the brightest of skin tone, should be concentrated just on the very utmost smallest areas. So the very things like tip of the nose, the tops of the ears, the eyebrows themselves, sort of the top part of the brow, maybe a few other bits like the chin's quite prominent there. But depending on the face that you're painting, you'll be able to identify these areas for yourself. And one of the advantages of using the overbrush technique as well is that when you start with your initial overbrush, it can be a little bit less delicate, and that will allow it to map out where your main highlights are going to end up anyway, because you'll be able to see what areas predominantly catch the paint as you're brushing it on. Okay, so now I'm actually going to go back and get a wash going again. So we've got a bit of red, a bit of green mixed in together. I might have had a little bit of purple in there as well, can't quite remember. Once I can get the camera focused in. And so what I'm going to do now is back with my fine point brush again, my size 1 brush. Just going to go in and very gently add a little bit of this wash just to build a bit more depth and a bit of colour in. So this is just going to help reinforce what we'd previously done with the initial wash before we put the skin tones on, and it just helps keep that the variation of colour, the kind of natural variation that you get in skin tones. So I'm just going to push that in, and I can go back and forth with this as you feel comfortable. Build it up in certain areas, things like that, and it just helps unify it all together. Especially sometimes when you're doing the overbrush, you can get a few areas where you don't quite hit it with the skin tone, and so you can see you've got the more predominantly green wash underneath, and so getting this wash that's pretty much similar but a little bit more red just helps sort of tie the skin together. And all I'm going to do is just a couple of passes with this wash to let it build up a little bit, just make sure that it completely dries between each one so you don't pull the layers off that are underneath. And I'm just going to focus a little bit more of the red around the eyes as well, same as what we did with the chap that we painted before, just to get that bleary red-eyed look. And so now that's done and that's completely dry, I'm happy with how that looks. It's time to go in and do the eyes. Exactly the same as with the last guy, just going in, doing some just little dots just to build it up gradually and gently, so I'm happy with it. That's really it for the eyes. And so here we go, we're more or less done now. I was just filling in the hair with a sort of dark grey, almost a black, just to kind of frame that off so you can see it better once I've got him in focus. And so you can see that's not a bad job for maybe 10-15 minutes of painting. It certainly does what we want it to do. It looks nice and grimdark, and same with this guy as well. You know, they look like some haunted chaps who've seen some terrible things, and there we go. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please let me know if you found it useful, and if you'd like to see more videos where I focus on maybe one or two techniques rather than showing how to paint an entire model from start to finish. I guess that all that's left to do now is to show you a couple of photos of the finished models so you can see them, and that's all for now. Thanks for watching. Bye.